Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. We asked the Ouija board for help. Instead, it gave us a curse. It started as a joke. My friend James found this old dusty Ouija board at a yard sale, tucked between some 80s horror VHS tapes and a broken Polaroid camera. I'll admit, I was hesitant. I'd always heard stories about Ouija boards, like how you're never supposed to play alone or in your own house, because you could invite something in. I didn't believe in that stuff, but I didn't exactly not believe in it either, you know? James, on the other hand, loved horror. He was practically obsessed. So when he suggested we try it out, he somehow convinced me to go along. And in all honesty, I figured it'd be a funny story to tell later. After all, we were two guys sitting around on a Saturday night with nothing better to do. It was either that or binge watch another terrible horror movie. We set up in James's basement, lights dimmed, just enough so we could barely make out the letters on the board. He brought out a couple of candles for atmosphere, and soon we were sitting there, the faint glow flickering against the walls. It felt silly at first, two grown men with their fingers on a planchette, waiting for something supernatural to happen. But then, things got weird. We asked the usual questions you'd expect. Is anyone here? What's your name? Nothing happened. The planchette didn't budge. James was laughing, saying stuff like, "See, just a piece of wood," and acting like he was about to call it a night. But for some reason, I felt this urge to keep going. I don't know what came over me, but I leaned in and asked, "Is there anyone who can help us?" That's when the planchette moved. It was slow at first, barely a shift, like a weak, hesitant tug. We both stared at each other, wide-eyed. I could feel my heart pounding, a mix of fear and excitement. The planchette moved again, this time more smoothly, and it settled on YES. We sat in stunned silence, and then James, in typical James fashion, grinned. "All right, so we're talking to... what? A ghost? A spirit?" He sounded half joking, but his face had a weird seriousness to it that didn't match his tone. I decided to keep going, even though every instinct was screaming at me to stop. "Can you help us?" I asked, not even sure what kind of help I was talking about. It just came out. The planchette moved again, spelling out a single word, C-U-R-S-E. I swallowed hard. "Curse!" "What curse?" There was a pause, like it was thinking. Then it began moving, letter by letter, in that slow, deliberate way that felt more like a threat than an answer. D-B-T. I laughed nervously. "Debt? Seriously? You're telling us you're here to help with our debt?" James laughed too, but it was forced. Hollow. Both of us had debts, student loans, credit cards, rent that never seemed to stop piling up. It was like this thing knew us. But that was impossible, right? "All right, ghost, spirit, whatever you are," James said, a bit shakily. "So what? You're going to make us rich, solve all our problems." The planchette started moving faster, gliding to YES, and then it paused, like it was waiting. James smirked, leaning back with a bit too much bravado. "All right then, do your worst." I didn't laugh that time. I don't know why, but I had a bad feeling, this knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. Something felt wrong. James seemed to notice. He shot me a look and said, "Dude, relax. It's a piece of wood on cardboard. What's the worst that could happen?" But I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just done something we couldn't undo. The planchette began moving again, faster this time, gliding from letter to letter as we watched in tense silence. W-A-I-T. It moved to S-I-G-N and then L-E-A-V-E. Sign. Leave. What the hell does that mean? I muttered, mostly to myself. But something about those words felt heavy, like they weren't just instructions, but an ultimatum. I could feel this weird pressure around us, a weight in the air, and I could have sworn I saw the shadows on the walls shift just slightly. James chuckled nervously, rubbing his arms like he'd just felt a chill. Probably means we're supposed to sign out or something, right? Like, sign here, and then leave it alone. He lifted his fingers off the planchette, and I did the same, watching it carefully. The planchette didn't move again. It just sat there, silent, like it was waiting. "All right, well, I think that's enough for tonight," James said, blowing out the candles with one quick puff. The room plunged into darkness, and we made our way back upstairs. We didn't talk much after that. I left soon after, and the whole way home, I couldn't shake this feeling, this nagging sense that we'd invited something in. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, even the faint rustle of the trees outside, felt like it was getting louder, like something was creeping up on me. I told myself it was just nerves, that I'd let the Ouija board get in my head, but deep down, I knew something had changed. The next day, I got a text from James. It was simple, just one line. "Did you have any weird dreams last night?" My fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure how to respond, because I'd had a dream, one that left me feeling sick and uneasy. In it, I was standing in a dark, empty room, surrounded by shadows that seemed to whisper and shift. And there, in the center of the room, was the Ouija board with something hovering over it. I couldn't see its face, but I knew instinctively it was watching me, waiting for me to ask another question. I finally replied, "Yeah, you?" He didn't respond. Days went by, and I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind, but it was like that night had left a stain on me. Every time I thought about it, I felt this prickling anxiety, like there was something just out of sight, lurking in the dark corners of my room. Then, about a week later, something strange happened. My bank account, which had been painfully low, showed a sudden deposit. $500. No note, no explanation. I checked my transactions, and there it was, labeled simply as payment received. I called the bank, but they couldn't tell me anything. They just said it was an anonymous payment and left it at that. I should have been happy. $500 isn't something you just turn down. But the whole thing left me feeling unsettled, like it was a down payment for something I hadn't agreed to. Then, the texts started coming. First, it was James. He finally replied to my last message, but it wasn't a normal response. His text just said, "It's coming for us." I tried calling him, but he didn't answer, and that's when the other texts started. Unknown numbers, strange symbols, cryptic messages that made no sense. One of them simply said, "The debt will be paid." Another read, "Sign or leave." I didn't know what to make of it, but one thing was clear. Whatever we'd let in that night hadn't gone away. It was waiting, watching, and the worst part, I had the horrible feeling that whatever price we'd agreed to was just starting. After that first text from James, my mind was stuck in a loop, trying to make sense of it. It's coming for us. What was coming? And what exactly had we signed up for that night? The more I thought about it, the more I felt like something was creeping up on me, like an invisible hand reaching out from the dark, just waiting for the right moment to grab hold. The next few days were unsettling, to say the least. I'd get random texts at odd hours from unknown numbers, all short and cryptic, like they were messages from another world. Some were just a series of numbers, others were symbols, and a few were single words that gave me chills. Time, debt, owed. I'd try to ignore them, delete them, but it didn't help. I'd still hear that familiar chime in the middle of the night, a new message lighting up my screen, each one more disturbing than the last. James, on the other hand, was radio silent. No texts, no calls, nothing. I tried reaching out to him, but every time it went straight to voicemail. I was starting to wonder if he'd gotten himself in trouble, or if this was some sick prank he'd roped me into. Then, one night, I got a message that froze me in my tracks. "We are watching you." I stared at my screen, my heart pounding. I typed out a quick reply, something along the lines of, "Who is this? What do you want?" But as soon as I hit send, another message came in, as if whoever, or whatever it was, had been waiting for me to respond. The debt must be paid. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. What debt? The only thing I owed was a stack of student loans and a maxed out credit card. But this didn't feel like a bill collector or some scam. No, this was something darker, something that had attached itself to me that night with the Ouija board, and it was demanding something I couldn't understand. Then, out of nowhere, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was from James. But it wasn't a message. It was a photo. I opened it, my hands shaking. The picture was dark and grainy, like it had been taken in a hurry. It showed a narrow, dimly lit hallway, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper. But that wasn't the part that freaked me out. Standing at the end of the hallway, almost invisible in the shadows, was a figure. A tall, thin shape with a head tilted slightly to the side, staring directly into the camera. I dropped my phone, my mind racing. I picked it back up and quickly typed out, "James, where are you? Is that you in the photo?" No response. The next day, I decided to go over to his place. I'd had enough of the creepy messages, the silence, the strange photo. I needed answers. And if I'm honest, I was worried about him. It didn't feel right to just ignore it anymore. When I got to his apartment, the building had this strange, heavy silence to it. I'd been there 100 times, but something felt different. Office. Like the air was thicker, harder to breathe. I took a deep breath and knocked on his door. No answer. I tried calling his phone again, pressing my ear to the door, hoping to hear it buzzing from the other side. Nothing. Then, as I turned to leave, I heard a faint scratching sound. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The scratching was coming from inside his apartment, just a slow, dragging scrape, like someone was running their fingernails down the walls. It sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't move, couldn't pull myself away. I tried the doorknob, and to my surprise, it turned easily in my hand. The door swung open with a creak, revealing his darkened apartment. I stood there for a second, debating whether to go inside, but the eerie silence around me felt like it was pushing me forward. So I stepped in. His place was trashed. Papers were strewn across the floor, chairs tipped over, and in the middle of it all was that same Ouija board we'd used, lying in the center of his living room floor with the planchette still on it, like it was waiting for us to come back. But that wasn't even the worst part. Scrawled across the walls in messy, jagged letters was a single word, repeated over and over: debt. I felt sick, like my stomach had dropped into my feet. It was everywhere, written in red, smeared across the walls, the furniture, the door. And then, just as I was about to bolt, I saw it. Another message, larger than the rest, written right above the Ouija board: sign or leave. I stumbled back, tripping over a stack of books, my head spinning. I didn't know what to think, didn't know what to believe. But I knew one thing. Whatever we'd unleashed that night wanted something from us, something we couldn't escape. Just as I was about to leave, my phone buzzed again, startling me so much I nearly dropped it. It was another message from an unknown number. Time is running out. I looked around the apartment one last time, that same message echoing in my mind, and I bolted out the door, slamming it shut behind me. But as I ran down the hallway, I heard it. That same scratching sound, louder this time, like it was right behind me, scraping along the walls, chasing me out. I didn't stop until I was home. The door locked behind me, my heart racing, mind spinning. I kept hearing that last message over and over in my head, wondering what it meant, wondering what it wanted. And in that moment, I realized something horrifying. Whatever this debt was, whatever curse we'd brought on ourselves, it wasn't just after James. It was after both of us. And the clock was ticking. I barely slept that night. I kept all the lights on in my apartment, pacing back and forth, jumping at every little sound. My phone was clutched tightly in my hand, just waiting for another message. I must have checked it 100 times, but nothing came. Just that same heavy silence. By the next morning, I was exhausted, my mind a jumble of half-formed thoughts and fears. I kept replaying what I'd seen in James's apartment. The scrawled words on the walls, the scratching sounds, the dark shape from the photo he'd sent. Every part of me wanted to believe it was just some elaborate prank. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something real was lurking, something we'd let in with that stupid Ouija board. Then, just as I was starting to convince myself I'd imagined it all, I got another text. This time, it wasn't from an unknown number. It was James. Meet me tonight. Usual spot. I hesitated, rereading it, my mind racing. There was something off about the message. It was short, with no explanation, no apology, nothing to acknowledge the days he'd left me in silence. But usual spot was clear enough. He meant the little park by the lake we used to hang out at when we were kids. I almost didn't go. But if there was a chance James had answers, a chance he could explain all this, I had to try. By the time the sun was setting, I'd already convinced myself to meet him, to at least get some closure. The park was deserted when I arrived, shadows stretching out across the grass as the last light of the day disappeared over the trees. I spotted James near the edge of the lake, standing completely still, facing the water with his back to me. I called out to him, but he didn't turn. He just kept staring, hands at his sides, perfectly motionless. As I got closer, a chill washed over me. I could barely make out his face in the dim light, but his expression was blank, almost hollow, like he wasn't really there. "James?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. "What's going on?" He turned, and in the fading light, I could see his eyes. They were wide, bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't smile, didn't greet me. Instead, he leaned in close and muttered, "It's too late for us." We let it in. My heart pounded as I tried to make sense of his words. "What do you mean? What did we let in?" He glanced around, eyes darting nervously into the shadows, as if something were hiding there, waiting. "The board. We made a deal. I didn't realize it then, but it wasn't a joke. It's real, and it's everywhere." Before I could say anything else, he grabbed my arm, his grip cold and firm, pulling me close. "I've seen it," he whispered, his voice shaking. "In reflections, in the dark, just out of the corner of my eye. It follows me. It's waiting." I tried to pull away, but he held on, his face inches from mine, his voice growing more frantic. "It's a debt, and it needs to be paid. We thought it was about money, but it's something else. Something worse." "What are you talking about?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. He let go finally, and looked back at the lake, his face pale and hollow. "It wants something from us, and it won't stop until it gets it." I didn't know what to say. I felt trapped, helpless. But before I could ask him anything more, he backed away, retreating into the shadows near the water's edge. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's after both of us now." And with that, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone by the lake, the cold wind biting at my skin. I stumbled back to my car, my head spinning, hands shaking. James's words kept replaying in my mind. "It's everywhere. It's waiting. It won't stop." I drove home in silence, too shaken to even turn on the radio. By the time I reached my apartment, night had fully set in, and every shadow felt like it was watching me. Inside, I went straight to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and stared at my reflection in the mirror, trying to ground myself. But then, something moved. It was faint, just a flicker, but I saw it. A shadow sliding along the corner of the mirror, like it was hiding, trying not to be seen. I backed away, heart pounding, feeling that same suffocating chill that had followed me all night. My reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed, but there, just over my shoulder, I could see it. A dark shape, leaning forward, close enough to touch. I whipped around, but nothing was there. Just my empty bathroom, silent and still. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little too far. Every reflection held something just out of sight. And at night, I'd hear faint scratching sounds, like nails dragging across the walls, creeping closer and closer. Then, one night, I woke up to find my phone screen lit up on the nightstand. Another message. The debt must be paid. Soon. My hands trembled as I held the phone, staring at those words. It was like the walls were closing in, like the shadows themselves were pressing down on me, suffocating. I didn't know what it wanted, what it would take to make this stop, but I could feel it. Whatever was coming was close. In a fit of desperation, I grabbed the Ouija board from where I'd hidden it under my bed, placing it on the floor, hands shaking as I positioned the planchette. I didn't know what I was doing, didn't even know if it would work, but I needed answers. I placed my fingers on the planchette and whispered, "What do you want from me?" For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. I was just sitting there, alone in my dark apartment, hands trembling, heart pounding. And then, slowly, the planchette began to move, sliding across the board in slow, deliberate strokes, spelling out a word that sent chills down my spine. Y-O-U. I yanked my hands away, breathing hard, feeling that same oppressive weight settling over me. It didn't want money, or a deal, or some abstract debt. It wanted me. As I sat there, paralyzed with fear, I saw it. A shadow shifting at the edge of the room, growing darker, spreading along the walls, inching closer and closer. And in the silence, I heard a faint whispering voice echoing in my mind. A voice that didn't belong to me, but sounded far too familiar. Time is running out. After that night with the Ouija board, my apartment was never the same. Every room felt suffocating, like something dark was lurking in every corner, watching me. I started keeping all the lights on, even during the day, but the shadows never left. They crept along the walls, just out of sight, like they were waiting for me to make a mistake. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd feel something shift in the room, a cold breeze that shouldn't have been there, or a faint scratching sound that seemed to come from inside the walls. I tried playing music, leaving the TV on, anything to drown it out, but it didn't help. The silence would settle over me like a weight, and in that silence, I could feel the thing we'd unleashed inching closer. One night, as I lay there staring at the ceiling, my phone buzzed. I jumped, reaching for it with a shaking hand. It was another message, this time from an unknown number. But it wasn't a cryptic threat or some disturbing picture. It was just one word: run. My heart raced as I read it over and over, trying to make sense of it. Run. Run where? This thing was in my apartment, following me everywhere I went. There was no running from something like this. And then, almost like it was responding to my thoughts, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a voice message. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the play button, a sick feeling churning in my stomach. Finally, I pressed play. The voice was distorted, low and crackling, like it was coming from the other side of a thick wall. But beneath the static, I recognized it immediately. It was James. "It's too late to run," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackle. "It's here. It's inside. You can't run from something that's already inside." The message cut off, and I sat there in stunned silence, my hand clenching the phone so hard my fingers ached. He was right. Whatever this was, it wasn't just some presence lurking in the dark. It was inside my life, my mind. And and it was growing stronger. I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. I threw on a hoodie, grabbed my keys, and bolted out the door. I needed air, space, anything that wasn't my 4 cramped walls and the creeping shadows. I didn't know where I was going, but my feet took me to the one place that had always been safe, the little park by the lake. The night was cold, a sharp wind biting through my jacket as I walked along the lake's edge, trying to clear my head. But as I walked, I noticed something strange. My shadow, stretched long under the streetlights, wasn't matching my movements. It lagged behind me, like it was struggling to keep up, twitching and shifting in ways that made my skin crawl. I stopped, staring at it, and the shadow stopped too, but not in the way it should have. It froze, unnaturally still, like it was watching me. I felt this horrible pull, like it was trying to draw me in, and for a moment I thought I could see a faint outline of something else inside it. A face, twisted and dark, eyes hollow and empty, staring back at me from the depths of the shadow. I stumbled back, heart pounding, tearing my eyes away. But the image stayed burned into my mind, a shadow that wasn't really mine, a shape that wore my outline, but something else's face. I couldn't stand it anymore. I pulled out my phone, dialing James's number in desperation. He was the only one who might understand. To my shock, he picked up on the first ring. "It won't let you go, you know that, right?" he said, his voice flat, almost resigned. There was a strange hollowness in his tone, like he'd already accepted something I was still fighting. "What do we do, James?" I asked, my voice barely holding steady. "There has to be a way out of this." He let out a shaky breath. "It's too late. It's already taken what it wants from me. Now it's your turn." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean? What did it take from you?" He was silent for a long time, and I thought he'd hung up. But then he spoke, so quietly I could barely hear him. "It took me, piece by piece. My reflection, my shadow. I barely recognize myself anymore. Sometimes I think I'm just a hollow shell, something wearing my face, pretending to be me." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "James, don't say that. We'll figure something out. He cut me off, his voice sharp and urgent. "Listen to me. It's only after one thing, us. It wants to take our place. That's the debt. That's the deal. If you don't pay up, it takes everything." A cold, sinking realization settled over me. This thing didn't want money or favors. It wanted us, our lives, our identities, and we'd opened the door for it. Before I could respond, James's voice softened, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry. I tried to stop it, but it's already too late for me. Maybe you can still..." The line went dead. I stood there, staring at my phone, the night pressing in around me, colder and darker than before. I was alone, and I could feel it. Whatever this thing was, it was closer now, circling me, watching from the shadows that stretched across the park. I stumbled back to my car, barely aware of my own movements, my mind racing, trying to think of a way out. But as I drove back to my apartment, I noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. The back seat, just barely visible in the dim light, was empty. But there was a faint outline of a shape sitting there, something dark and indistinct, its head tilted to the side, as if it were watching me drive. I tried not to look, tried to keep my eyes on the road, but I could feel it there, a cold, creeping presence that seeped into every corner of the car. And then, just as I thought I'd imagined it, I saw it move. Just a slight shift, like it was leaning forward, waiting. I slammed on the brakes, nearly swerving off the road, and when I looked back again, the shape was gone. But I knew, deep down, that it hadn't left. It was just waiting, getting closer, inching forward every time I turned my back. When I finally got home, I didn't even turn the lights on. I sat in the dark, my back to the wall, staring at the empty room, waiting for something to move, something to reach out from the shadows. I could feel it now, so close I could almost hear it breathing, feel its cold presence pressing in around me. And as I sat there, I finally understood. This thing, it wasn't some random curse, some accidental haunting. It was a deal we'd made, a price we'd agreed to pay the moment we'd touched that Ouija board. And now, it was here to collect. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have, because I woke up in darkness. At first, I thought it was still night, but then I noticed the heavy silence, the unnatural stillness in the air. I couldn't hear the hum of my fridge or the distant sounds of cars outside. It was like I'd slipped into a place where time didn't exist. I sat up, squinting into the dark. That's when I noticed the shadows, thick and looming, twisting along the walls like smoke. They moved in slow, writhing waves, circling me, closing in, like I was caught in the center of something alive. My phone was dead, the screen dark and unresponsive. I was alone in the silence, and I could feel it watching, that dark presence waiting for me to acknowledge it. I stood up slowly, heart pounding, and looked around, and there it was, my shadow, standing upright, detached from me, almost as solid as a person. It was tall, stretched out unnaturally, with limbs too long and thin. Its face was my own, but wrong, hollow and twisted, eyes sunken and empty, a crooked smile pulling across its lips. It took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was still learning how to move. My stomach twisted as I felt this sick, instinctual fear. It was me, but not me. It was the thing we'd let in. I didn't mean to, I whispered, barely able to get the words out. I didn't know what I was doing. Just leave me alone. The shadow's smile widened, and it tilted its head as if considering my words. Then, in a voice that echoed like a whisper inside my mind, it replied, "You called for me. You asked for help. I answered. And now, you owe me." Its voice was hollow, echoing, not quite a sound, but more like a thought being forced into my head. I backed up, pressing myself against the wall, but it only took another step closer, mirroring my movements with a strange, mocking precision. What do you want from me?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. It didn't answer right away. It just stood there, watching me with those hollow eyes, that grin stretching wider until it looked like its mouth would split open. And then, slowly, it raised a hand, extending one long twisted finger to point directly at me. "Your place," it whispered, its voice low and reverberating. "A life for a life. Your debt is me." I felt a chill wash over me as the words sank in. It didn't want anything physical, nothing I could pay off or escape from. It wanted to take my life, my identity, to become me in every sense of the word. I was nothing more than an empty vessel, a means for it to enter this world. No, I won't let you," I muttered, my fists clenching. But the shadow only laughed, a low, rumbling sound that made my skin crawl. "You already have." In a desperate attempt, I lunged for the door, trying to escape, but the room shifted, the walls stretching and twisting, closing in on me. I felt like I was running in place, each step sinking into the floor like quicksand, the shadow following me with slow, deliberate steps. And then, the lights in the room flickered, just for a moment, and I caught a glimpse of my own reflection in the window. But it wasn't me. It was the shadow, standing there with my face, my eyes, my twisted grin. It looked like me, but there was something darker, emptier behind its eyes. I staggered back, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what was happening. But deep down, I knew. I could feel it taking over, slipping into my skin, pushing me out piece by piece. It was like my very self was unraveling, being pulled away thread by thread, as if I were nothing more than a shell, I fought it, every instinct screaming at me to resist, to hold on. But it was stronger, more patient, and as the last bit of light flickered and went out, I felt it settle over me. A cold, consuming darkness that swallowed everything I was. And then, silence. I don't know how long I was trapped there, lost in that cold, empty space. But when I opened my eyes, the room was still. The shadows had returned to normal, the world quiet and unchanged. But I wasn't the same. I could feel it, something cold and hollow, lurking just beneath my skin. I looked around the room, trying to remember who I was, what I'd been fighting for. But every thought, every memory felt distant, blurred. I was here, but not entirely. My mind was my own, but something else was there too, watching, waiting, just beneath the surface. In the corner of the room, I saw a mirror, its surface cloudy and dark. I stepped closer, almost against my will, staring into the reflection, trying to find myself. But the person staring back wasn't me. I lifted my hand, and the reflection mirrored me. But there was a delay, a split-second lag that sent a chill through me. And then, slowly, its mouth twisted into a grin, a wide, empty smile that I hadn't made. I stumbled back, feeling that cold presence rise up again, a whisper at the edge of my mind, a reminder of the debt I'd tried and failed to escape. Now, every time I pass by a mirror, every reflection I catch in a window or a screen, I see it. Just a flicker, a hint of something dark and wrong, waiting for its moment to break free. And in those brief, horrifying glimpses, I realized the truth. I paid the debt. But I'll never be alone again. The Ouija board said to keep the lights on. When we didn't, something moved in the dark. So, it's safe to say I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. Ghosts, demons, curses, all of it just seemed like the stuff of movies and late-night campfire stories. But recently, something happened that's changed the way I see things, and I can't shake the feeling that it isn't over. It's like whatever we messed with, well, it's still out there. And if you're reading this, I guess you're probably the type to want the whole story, right? It started on a random Friday night. My buddies, Mark and Dylan, and I were hanging out at my place, bored out of our minds. We'd played every game, watched every movie, and we were getting desperate for something new. Then Dylan, who always has a knack for finding the weirdest stuff online, pulls out his phone and shows us a forum post. "I found this thing people are trying," he said, his eyes wide with excitement. "It's some sort of Ouija board challenge, but with a twist." Now, I'd used a Ouija board once or twice before, and nothing really happened. But Dylan's grin had me intrigued. He read the post aloud, and it went something like this. "Do not use this Ouija board alone. You must keep at least one light on in the room at all times. Whatever happens, do not turn off the lights, and do not blow out any candles if you're using them." It was vague and weird, with lots of comments from people sharing strange experiences, stories about weird shadows moving in the corners, or hearing faint whispers when they asked questions. Mark laughed it off, but Dylan, ever the thrill-seeker, wanted to try it. He said it was probably just some hoax to freak people out, and Mark and I were pretty skeptical. But boredom and curiosity make a dangerous combination, so we all agreed to give it a shot. Dylan had an old Ouija board stashed in his basement. Of course he did. So he grabbed it and brought it over. We set it up in my living room, which felt safe enough with all the lights on, like we were just messing around. We weren't taking it seriously, at least not yet. We set the board down, lit a few candles for extra atmosphere, Dylan's idea obviously, and settled in around it. I could feel this weird energy in the room, but I chalked it up to nerves and excitement. Dylan started things off, placing his fingers on the planchette, and Mark and I followed suit, trying not to laugh. "All right," Dylan said, grinning. "Let's see if this thing actually works. Is anyone here with us?" We waited, The planchette didn't move. The room was silent except for the occasional flicker of the candle flames. Just when I thought it was a bust, the planchette jerked slightly under our fingers. We all glanced at each other, eyes wide, but no one said anything. Then, slowly, it moved to Y-E-S. We were too freaked out to even accuse each other of moving it. I could feel this heaviness in the air, like something was watching us. My mind raced, telling myself it was just one of my friends messing around. But there was something off. Dylan asked the next question. "Are you friendly?" The planchette didn't move for a while, but just as we were about to give up, it shifted again, this time to N-O. I laughed nervously, but it didn't feel funny. In the dim light, everything seemed a little darker. I swear I saw a shadow move near the wall, but I brushed it off. It was just a trick of the candlelight, right? Mark looked uncomfortable. Maybe we should stop. But Dylan was too deep into it. He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "What do you want?" At that moment, the candle closest to us went out with a soft hiss, plunging half the room into darkness. We all jumped, and for a second, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I reached for the light switch, flicking it on, but the light didn't come. Mark grabbed his phone and tried turning on his flashlight, but his screen just flickered, like it was struggling to stay on. "Maybe we really should keep the lights on," Mark muttered, glancing nervously at the shadows creeping in around us. Dylan just shrugged it off. "It's probably just a blown bulb or something. You guys are too jumpy." But I was starting to feel uneasy. The room was too quiet, too still. I could feel a chill settle over us, like the temperature had dropped. And then we heard it. It was faint at first, like a soft rustling sound coming from the corner of the room, just beyond the edge of the candlelight. I strained my ears, trying to figure out if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the sound grew louder, shifting, almost like footsteps. Mark's face went pale. "Did you hear that?" Dylan shook his head, but I could see he was starting to look a little uneasy too. "Maybe it's just the wind or something. I mean, it's not like..." And then, clear as day, we heard a whisper, low and raspy, coming from right behind us. "Turn it off." The three of us whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows pressing in close, almost as if they were alive, shifting and pulsing with this dark energy. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. This presence looming over us, watching, waiting. It was so intense I could feel it pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I reached for the candle, my hands shaking, ready to light it again, but my fingers froze. In the faint glow, I saw something, just for a split second. A figure, standing right there in the shadows, just inches away, staring at me with these hollow, empty eyes. I gasped, pulling my hand back, and the figure vanished. Dylan noticed my reaction, and he looked where I'd been staring. "What did you see?" I couldn't speak. My throat felt dry, and my heart was pounding in my ears. But before I could say anything, the planchette moved again, spelling out one last chilling message. KEEPELIGHTSON. Mark didn't need any more convincing. He grabbed his phone, trying to get the flashlight to work again, but the screen was still glitching. Dylan reached for the candles, frantically trying to light them, but each one kept flickering out the second he struck a match. The room grew colder, darker. Shadows crept closer, wrapping around us like some sort of living mist. I could feel it pressing in on me, cold and suffocating, making my skin prickle with fear. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. It was like the shadows had me pinned in place, forcing me to stay, to watch. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, there was a loud knock on the wall, so close it felt like it came from right inside the room. We all jumped, our heads snapping toward the sound. In the dim, flickering light, we could see something moving. this slow, shifting shape that seemed to crawl out of the shadows, stretching long, skeletal fingers across the floor, reaching toward us. Mark broke first, scrambling to his feet. "We're done. I'm out." He bolted for the door, and Dylan and I were right behind him, not daring to look back. We ran out of the house and didn't stop until we were halfway down the street, panting and gasping for air. We stood there in the cold night, staring back at my house, which looked eerily dark, even with the porch light on. After that, we made a pact. No more Ouija boards, no more late-night deep web dares, no more messing with things we didn't understand. I haven't touched that board since, and I refuse to go back in that room at night. But sometimes when I'm lying in bed, I still hear it, the faint, soft whisper telling me to turn off the lights. The next day, none of us really talked about what happened. I think we were all trying to convince ourselves it was just a trick of the light, or our minds playing games. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The way those shadows moved, the way the planchette spelled out, "Keep the lights on," with this urgency, it felt real. Too real. Dylan texted us around noon, acting like nothing had happened, asking if we wanted to hang out again. Mark was hesitant, but I figured sticking together was better than being alone with whatever had crawled into my head that night. So we all met up at Dylan's place, trying to keep things as normal as possible. No mention of the Ouija board, just movies, pizza, the usual. But as soon as the sun went down, that strange tension came back. We were sitting in the living room, watching some horror movie that none of us were really paying attention to. I kept glancing at the shadows in the corners, half expecting to see them moving again. And every time the lights flickered, I felt this cold, prickling sensation on my neck, like we weren't really alone. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "You guys feel anything weird right now?" He said it casually, trying to laugh it off, but I could hear the unease in his voice. Dylan shrugged, a little too quickly. "I'm fine," he said, his eyes darting around the room. "I mean, yeah, last night was freaky, but it's over. Just a weird Ouija board experience, right?" But I knew he didn't believe that. I could see it in the way he kept glancing at the windows, the way his hands were clenched, like he was trying to hide how uneasy he was. And then, out of nowhere, the power went out. The room plunged into darkness, and I felt my stomach twist. Mark fumbled for his phone, flicking on the flashlight, and for a second, everything was fine. But then, the shadows started to shift again, creeping along the walls, moving like they had a mind of their own. Dylan laughed nervously, pulling out his own phone. "Guess this is just perfect timing, huh?" But as his flashlight flickered to life, we saw it. Something standing in the far corner of the room. Just a shape, dark and still, almost like a person, except it wasn't solid. It was this twisted shadow, blending into the darkness, with hollow pits where its eyes should have been. Mark's hand tightened around his phone, the light trembling as he held it up to the figure. "Do you see that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. None of us moved. None of us even breathed. I could feel this cold, heavy pressure in the room, like something was pulling all the warmth and air out of the space, pressing down on us, watching us. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, those empty pits staring straight through me. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The lights flickered back on, casting everything in this harsh, almost blinding light, and the shadow vanished, leaving nothing but an eerie silence in its wake. We all sat there, stunned, looking at each other, not sure what to say. Dylan tried to laugh it off again, but it sounded hollow, forced. "Guess we're all just seeing things," he mumbled, rubbing the back of his neck. But none of us believed that. We'd all seen it, felt it, this dark presence that was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the lights to go out. I could tell Mark was freaked out. His hands were still shaking, and he wouldn't stop glancing at the corner where the figure had been. I could feel it too, this gnawing dread that whatever we'd unleashed wasn't done with us. By the time we left Dylan's, it was late, and I felt this overwhelming urge to get home, to lock myself in my room and turn on every light. But as soon as I stepped into my house, I felt it. The same cold, heavy air that had settled over us in Dylan's living room. The lights in the hallway flickered as I walked down it, and I could feel something watching me from the shadows. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear these faint whispers, like someone was standing just outside my room, muttering under their breath. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded angry, like whatever it was waiting for me to slip up, to make a mistake. Around 3 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, turning on every single light in my room, my hands shaking. I sat there, wrapped in my blanket, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. And then, just as I was starting to relax, I saw it. In the reflection of my bedroom mirror, a shadow stood just behind me, watching me with those same hollow, empty eyes. I whipped around, but there was nothing there, just the empty room, silent and still. But when I looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer, its face inches from mine, staring at me with this intense, twisted hunger. I bolted out of my room, heart racing, barely able to breathe. I ran down the hallway, flicking on every light I passed, trying to chase the darkness away. But no matter how many lights I turned on, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was following me, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment I'd be alone in the dark again. The next morning, I called Dylan and Mark, desperate to tell them what had happened, to see if they'd experienced anything similar. Mark sounded exhausted, his voice raw and shaky. He'd heard the whispers too, the same faint, angry muttering that kept him up all night. And when he'd tried to ignore it, he'd seen a shadow standing at the foot of his bed, watching him with those empty, hungry eyes. Dylan was quiet for a moment before he admitted that he hadn't slept either. He'd felt the presence, that cold, suffocating energy pressing down on him, keeping him awake. And when he'd finally closed his eyes, he'd heard someone whispering his name, soft and raspy, like they were standing right next to him. We were all starting to realize that this wasn't something we could just ignore. Whatever we'd unleashed, it was getting stronger, more desperate. And the more we tried to convince ourselves it wasn't real, the closer it seemed to get. That night, we made a pact. We'd all keep the lights on, no matter what, and check in on each other if anything happened. It seemed silly, childish even, but I didn't care. I'd do anything to keep that shadow away, to stop seeing those hollow eyes staring back at me from the darkness. But it was only the beginning. By the third night, we were all hanging on by a thread. Mark was barely talking, looking more exhausted each time I saw him, and Dylan had become paranoid, jumping at every little sound and flicker of light. As for me, I was stuck in this weird half state of constant anxiety and disbelief. I kept telling myself it was all in our heads, that we'd freaked ourselves out, but no amount of logic could drown out the whispers or the shadows creeping in at night. We stuck to our pact, keeping every light on in our rooms. But somehow, even with every bulb burning bright, the shadows found their way in. They would shift around the edges of the light, hovering just out of reach, like they were taunting us, waiting for the moment we slipped up. The worst part was how they knew our names. It was around midnight when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Mark, simple but enough to make my heart race. "Don't go to sleep." I called him immediately, but he didn't answer. The call went straight to voicemail. Panicking, I called Dylan, hoping he'd know what was going on, but he picked up sounding just as terrified as I was. "Mark's not answering me either," he whispered, his voice barely above a tremble. He told me he'd heard something outside his window, and then he just stopped responding. For a split second, I felt that same suffocating chill creeping up my spine, like a cold hand pressing down on me. I tried to stay calm, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Really wrong. "I think we need to go check on him," I said, barely able to keep my voice steady. Dylan hesitated but agreed, so I grabbed my jacket and headed out. The streets were empty, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and twist as I walked by. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like something was following me, lurking just out of sight. But every time I turned around, the road was empty. When I reached Mark's house, I found Dylan waiting outside, pale and anxious. He looked relieved to see me, but his face was tense. I tried calling him again, but nothing. I've knocked too, but he's not answering. I nodded, feeling that same sense of dread growing stronger. We made our way to Mark's window, and that's when we saw it. A dark figure standing inside his room, facing the door. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a shape, almost human, but twisted and wrong, its limbs too long, its head cocked at a strange angle. And those empty eyes, they were staring straight at us through the glass. We both froze, unable to look away. The figure's face was hollow, like it was carved out of the darkness itself, and yet I could feel its gaze pressing into us, like it knew we were there, watching. I reached for my phone, my fingers shaking, ready to call the police. But before I could, the figure turned, melting into the shadows of Mark's room, leaving nothing but an empty, silent space behind. Dylan and I stumbled back, breathing hard, too scared to move. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, some weird shadow from the trees outside. But there was no mistaking the way it had looked at us, like it was waiting, watching, feeding off our fear. We finally worked up the courage to go inside, finding the door unlocked. Mark's house was silent, and every step we took echoed through the empty halls. We called his name, but there was no answer. His parents were out of town, and the place felt abandoned, like it had been that way for years. When we reached his room, we stopped short. The lights were all off, even though he'd promised to keep them on, and his room was freezing. A small puddle of water glistened on the floor near his bed, leading to the open window, which was letting in the icy night air. Dylan flipped the switch, but the light flickered, barely illuminating the room before going dark again. "Mark?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. We took a step closer, and that's when we saw it. A message scrawled across the wall in what looked like damp, inky smudges. The letters were crooked, slanting, almost like they'd been scratched into the wall by hand. And the words were simple, but chilling. "Don't turn them off." We backed out of the room, our breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. We didn't know what to do. Mark was nowhere to be found, and there was no sign of a struggle, but that message. It was like he'd left it there for us, like he knew we'd come looking. By the time we made it back outside, we were both shaking. I tried calling Mark again, but his phone was off, and I had this horrible feeling that he was gone, that the shadows had taken him somehow. It sounded insane, like something out of a horror movie, but I couldn't shake it. Dylan and I didn't talk much on the way home. We were too freaked out, too shaken by what we'd seen. But before we parted ways, Dylan grabbed my arm, his face pale and serious. "We have to keep the lights on," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever this thing is, it's feeding off the dark, and if we let it in..." He didn't finish, but he didn't have to. I knew exactly what he meant. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept every light on in my room, clutching my phone in one hand, waiting for a call or a text from Mark. But all I got were whispers, faint and angry, coming from the corners of the room, just beyond the reach of the light. It was like the shadows were gathering there, pulsing and shifting, biding their time. I thought I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then, just as I was starting to doze off, I heard it. A faint, raspy voice, whispering my name from the shadows. I opened my eyes, heart pounding, and saw a figure standing just outside the light, its empty eyes staring straight at me. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched, its hollow face twisted in this sick, predatory smile. And in that moment, I knew two things. One, Mark was gone, and 2, if we didn't keep the lights on, we'd be next. The following day, Dylan and I met up again, this time at a coffee shop. Neither of us wanted to be alone, and anywhere with bright lights and people around felt like the safest option. We sat there in silence for a while, each of us trying to process everything that had happened. Mark was missing, and we both knew, deep down, that it had something to do with whatever we'd summoned with that Ouija board. I keep thinking, maybe he's just hiding somewhere, Dylan said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. Like maybe he's freaked out and laying low. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the memory of that figure in Mark's room, standing there like it was waiting for us. You saw what I saw, Dylan. That thing was in his room. It's following us. Dylan went quiet, staring at his coffee, his hands trembling. We were both exhausted, running on caffeine and nerves, barely sleeping since it all started, but I could tell he wasn't ready to accept it yet. None of us wanted to believe that shadows could follow you home, that they could take someone like that. That night, I didn't even bother with my bed. I sat up on the couch, every light in the living room blazing. I figured if I stayed in the open, where the light was brightest, maybe I'd be safe. But as the hours ticked by, the house started to feel different. The air grew colder, heavier, like it was filled with static. And then the whispers began again, louder than before, hissing from every corner of the room, circling me like a warning. I turned up the volume on the TV, trying to drown them out, but the voices didn't stop. They grew sharper, more frantic, until I could almost make out words. I squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself it wasn't real, that I was just tired. But then, clear as day, I heard it. We're still here. My eyes snapped open, and there, in the reflection of the TV screen, was a shadow standing in the hallway, its hollow eyes staring at me. I spun around, heart hammering, but the hallway was empty. No shadow, no figure, just an empty, dim corridor that seemed to stretch on forever in the darkness. I called Dylan, desperate to hear another voice, anything to remind me that I wasn't alone in this. He picked up on the first ring, his voice shaky. I heard them too, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The whispers. They're getting louder. Neither of us wanted to say it out loud, but we both knew what it meant. The thing we'd summoned was getting stronger. The more we tried to ignore it, the closer it seemed to come. It was like it was feeding off our fear, growing bolder, coming closer each night. Then Dylan told me something that chilled me to my core. I tried to turn off the lights, just for a second, to see if it was really there, he admitted, his voice trembling. The second I did, it was right in front of me, standing so close I could feel it breathing. It whispered my name, like it was daring me to stay in the dark. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell him he was crazy, that it was all in his head, but I knew better. Whatever this thing was, it thrived in the shadows, and it was only a matter of time before it caught up to us, just like it had with Mark. We made a plan that night. We'd go back to where it started, the Ouija board, that stupid dare. Maybe if we destroyed it, we'd break the connection, end whatever it was that had latched onto us. I wasn't sure it would work, but it was the only idea we had left. The next evening, we met at Dylan's place. He'd stashed the board in his basement after that first night, and the thought of going down there made my skin crawl. We flipped on every light we could find, clutching flashlights in our hands like lifelines as we crept down the stairs. The basement was freezing, colder than I remembered, and every shadow seemed to pulse with this quiet, malevolent energy, like it was alive. I felt like I was walking into a trap, like the thing was just waiting for us, hiding somewhere in the darkness. Dylan pulled the board out from an old cardboard box, and I could have sworn the air grew even colder. Just touching it made my skin prickle, like the wood itself was holding some dark energy. He set it on the floor, and we doused it in lighter fluid. our hands shaking as we fumbled with the matches. But the second we struck a match, the lights went out. The basement plunged into total darkness, and I felt my heart stop. The only light came from the tiny flicker of the match in Dylan's hand, casting eerie, dancing shadows that seemed to grow and stretch, reaching out toward us. And then, I felt it. A cold, heavy hand on my shoulder. I froze, every nerve in my body screaming, but I couldn't move. I could feel its breath, icy and rancid, brushing against my ear, whispering my name in that same raspy voice. I could hear Dylan breathing hard beside me, but he didn't dare turn around. With a shaky hand, Dylan dropped the match onto the board, and it burst into flames, filling the room with a blinding, searing light. The shadows recoiled, twisting and writhing as the flames consumed the board, and for a moment I thought we'd done it, that we'd broken whatever connection it had to us. But then, over the roar of the fire, I heard it again. A voice, low and mocking, coming from every corner of the room. "It doesn't matter. We're already here." The flames died down, leaving nothing but charred ashes and the faint, lingering scent of smoke. We stood there, breathing hard, staring at the burnt remains of the board, waiting for something to happen. But the room was silent, empty. No more whispers, no shadows moving in the darkness. I wanted to believe it was over, that burning the board had worked, that we'd finally broken free. But deep down, I knew better. The shadows had followed us, attached themselves to us, and now that they'd crossed over, I wasn't sure if anything could send them back. Dylan and I stumbled out of the basement, feeling like we'd just escaped a nightmare. But as we reached the top of the stairs, we heard one last, faint whisper echoing up from the darkness below. "Don't turn off the lights." We slammed the door shut, our hearts pounding, and we didn't look back. But as I walked home that night, every shadow seemed darker, every streetlight flickering just a little too long. I could feel it, the thing we'd let into our lives, watching me from every corner, waiting for the moment I'd be alone in the dark again. And somehow, I knew that no matter how bright the lights, the darkness was still there, lurking just out of reach, biding its time. It's been 2 weeks since we burned the Ouija board, and in that time, I've learned how fragile a person's sanity can be when they're too scared to close their eyes. Dylan and I have barely slept since that night in the basement. Every time we start to drift off, the whispers begin, and the shadows start shifting, pressing in closer, like they're waiting for the lights to go out. And the worst part, it doesn't matter where we are. Whatever we unleashed has followed us, clinging to us like a shadow we can't shake. Last night, Dylan texted me just after midnight, a simple, desperate message. "I can't do this anymore." I called him right away, but he didn't pick up. Panic set in as I stared at my phone, wondering if he'd done something reckless. I was halfway to his place before he finally called me back, his voice a wreck of fear and exhaustion. "It's here, man," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's right outside my door. I can hear it breathing." I told him to stay where he was, to keep every light on, to wait until I got there. I sped over, running red lights, my heart pounding the whole way. When I reached his house, I found him sitting in his living room, every light blazing, his face pale and his hands shaking. "It's not going away," he whispered as I sat down beside him. I thought burning the board would be enough, but it's like it just unleashed something. We sat there in silence, both of us too afraid to turn off a single light, too terrified to even glance at the shadows. I could feel the presence lurking, watching, like it was waiting for one of us to make a move, to let our guard down for just a second. Around 3 a.m., we heard a soft creaking sound, like someone walking up the stairs. Dylan's face went white, and we both froze, staring at the hallway where the shadows were gathering, swirling, almost like they were alive. The whispers started again, low and mocking, filling the room with this sick, twisted energy. I could barely make out the words, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. Let us in. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit there, trapped by the darkness that was closing in around us. But I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. All I could do was sit there, paralyzed with fear, as the shadows pressed closer, reaching out with long, twisted fingers that seemed to stretch and grow, hungry for the light. Dylan reached for my hand, his grip tight, desperate. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, barely able to speak. We bolted, grabbing our bags and racing out the front door, not daring to look back. We drove around the neighborhood in silence, the streetlights casting eerie, flickering shadows that seemed to follow us, stretching and twisting in ways they shouldn't. Every time we passed a dark alley, I felt eyes on me, hollow and cold, watching with that same hungry gaze. We ended up at a cheap, all-night diner on the edge of town, figuring it was as good a place as any to hide. It was bright, filled with people, the kind of place where the shadows didn't dare to linger. But even there I felt it, the weight of those eyes watching, waiting, just beyond the edge of the light. We ordered coffee, trying to pretend that everything was normal, that we were just two friends hanging out in the middle of the night. But neither of us touched our cups. We just sat there, staring at the bright fluorescent lights, terrified of what might happen if they went out. After a while, Dylan broke the silence. "Do you think it'll ever stop?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to reassure him, to tell him that we'd find a way out of this, that it was all just some messed up prank or hallucination. But I couldn't lie. Not anymore. "I don't know," I said quietly, staring down at my untouched coffee. "But I don't think it's going to let us go." We sat there in silence, both of us knowing that we'd crossed a line, that whatever was following us wasn't just some figment of our imaginations. It was real, and it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. Then, just as I was starting to think we'd be safe as long as we stayed in the lights in the diner flickered. Dylan and I both froze, staring up at the ceiling as the lights dimmed, then brightened, then dimmed again. The other patrons didn't seem to notice, but I felt it. The cold, creeping sensation of something watching us, lurking just outside the edges of the light. And then, out of nowhere, the power went out. The diner was plunged into darkness, and I felt my heart stop. The whispers started immediately, filling the room with that same sick, mocking tone, echoing off the walls, growing louder, closer. I could barely make out the shape of Dylan beside me, his face a mask of terror, his hand clutching mine in a death grip. We bolted out of our seats, using the glow of our phones to navigate through the pitch-black room. I could feel it pressing in on us, the shadows wrapping around us cold and suffocating, like it was trying to drag us under. I could hear the whispers, clearer now, like a chorus of voices, each one more desperate, more hungry. "Come with us, into the dark." We stumbled out of the diner, gasping for air, our breaths visible in the cold night. The streetlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to reach for us, stretching across the pavement like dark, twisted fingers. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I knew that if I did, I'd see it standing there, waiting, watching, its hollow eyes fixed on me with that same twisted, hungry gaze. We didn't go home that night. We didn't even go back to our cars. We just kept walking, sticking to the brightest streets, staying under the streetlights, our eyes darting to every shadow, every corner, knowing that it was out there, waiting for the moment we'd slip into the dark. It's been 3 days since that night, and I'm not sure how much longer we can keep going like this. We've tried everything, candles, flashlights, anything to keep the shadows at bay. But it's getting harder. The lights are flickering more often, the whispers are growing louder, and the shadows, they're closer now, stretching longer, reaching out, almost like they're taunting us. Dylan and I have barely slept. We've stopped going to work, stopped talking to anyone else. It's like we're living in this constant state of fear, waiting for the moment the lights will go out for good. And every time they flicker, every time the shadows move, I feel it. The pull of the darkness, drawing me closer, calling me by name. Last night, I woke up to the sound of whispering right beside my bed. I didn't dare open my eyes, but I could feel it there, inches from my face, its cold breath brushing against my skin. "Come with us," it whispered, soft and inviting. "You can't escape. You belong in the dark. I don't know how much longer I can fight it. The lights don't seem to keep it away anymore. It's like it's inside me now, in my mind, in my dreams, calling me, drawing me closer to the shadows. And deep down, I know that eventually the lights will go out for good, and when they do, I'll be waiting there in the dark, just like it wants." We found an old Ouija board in the woods. It's been answering questions. We didn't ask. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just me and 2 friends from college, Mark and Ellie. We'd been talking about it for weeks, planning this break from city life to unwind and get away from our phones for a weekend. We found a spot way out in the woods, a few hours' drive from the city, far from anyone else, secluded, peaceful, and exactly what we needed. The trip started out fine. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and even managed to get a fire going without too much trouble. By nightfall, we were huddled around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling each other dumb stories. It wasn't until the next morning that things started to feel off. We decided to explore the area, wander through the trails, and maybe find a good spot for some photos. Mark had been scrolling online before the trip and found a few hidden gems nearby. Small waterfalls, clearings with wildflowers, stuff like that. We were about half a mile off the main trail when Ellie stopped dead in her tracks. There, half buried under some leaves and sticks, was this old wooden box. It looked like it had been there for a long time, weathered and cracked, with the wood warped like it had been left out in the rain. I half expected it to be some kind of animal trap, but it didn't look like that. Ellie knelt down and brushed away some of the dirt, her curiosity getting the better of her. When she lifted the lid, we all went quiet. Inside was an old Ouija board, carved out of wood, with letters and symbols burned into it, faded but still legible. It looked handmade, like someone had spent hours carefully crafting it. The planchette was there too, heavy and polished, unlike the plastic ones you see in stores. Mark, always the skeptic, rolled his eyes and said it was probably some kid's idea of a prank. But Ellie and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was strange, like we'd stumbled onto something we weren't supposed to find. "Guys, we have to try it out," Ellie said, her eyes lighting up with excitement. I hesitated. I mean, I wasn't necessarily afraid of it, but something about finding a random Ouija board out in the middle of the woods gave me a bad vibe. Mark shrugged, saying it would make a good story, and against my better judgment, I agreed. We brought it back to camp, set it down on the flat rock next to the fire pit, and all sat around it. The forest was quiet, like the trees were holding their breath, watching. Ellie placed her fingers on the planchette and shot us both a daring look. "Is there anyone here with us?" she asked, almost playfully. For a moment, nothing happened. The planchette sat perfectly still, and I was just about to make a joke when it started moving, slow and steady. I swore I wasn't moving it, and neither were they. It slid across the board, landing on yes. A chill crept down my spine. I glanced at Mark, expecting him to laugh or call it out as a prank, but he was silent, eyes locked on the board. Ellie, looking a little spooked but intrigued, asked another question. "What's your name?" The planchette paused and then began to spell something out. M-I-L-D-R-E-D. Mildred. None of us said anything for a moment, but then Ellie asked, "Are you from around here?" The planchette shot straight to No. Then how did you get here? I blurted out, not expecting an answer. But it didn't spell out words this time. Instead, it started moving in circles, round and round the board, faster and faster, almost like it was impatient, like it didn't want to answer. The movement was erratic, sharp and unsettling. I could feel a strange tension in the air, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Mark, in his usual skeptical tone, laughed it off and pulled his hands away. "This is dumb," he said, breaking the silence. "Someone probably left it here as a joke." Ellie and I looked at each other, unsure, but we let it go, figuring he was right. We packed the board back into the box and stashed it by the edge of our campsite, intending to leave it there. But that night, as we lay in our tents, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint whispers, like voices in the distance, drifting through the trees. I told myself it was the wind, just my imagination running wild, but it was hard to shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Around midnight, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside my tent, soft and deliberate. I held my breath, listening as the steps moved slowly around our campsite, stopping just outside Ellie's tent, then Mark's. My heart pounded as I listened, frozen in place, too scared to call out. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps stopped. Silence fell over the campsite, thick and heavy. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or something, but deep down, I knew it was something else. The next morning, I asked Ellie and Mark if they'd heard anything, but they just shrugged it off, saying I must have been dreaming. But when we walked over to where we'd left the box, my blood ran cold. The Ouija board was back out of the box, sitting neatly on the ground. And the planchette, it was pointing directly at the word, hello. None of us wanted to admit it, but seeing the Ouija board back out of the box was unnerving. Ellie tried to laugh it off, saying maybe one of us was messing with the others, but the way her voice cracked gave her away. Mark shrugged, tossing a stick into the fire, trying to act unfazed, but I noticed he was keeping his distance from the board. "All right, which one of you jokers did it?" he said, trying to lighten the mood, but no one answered. Ellie and I just stared at each other, each of us silently asking the same question. We'd all gone to bed at the same time. I'd heard those footsteps around my tent, but even then, I knew it wasn't them. Someone, something, had been walking around our camp last night. And now this. Ellie crossed her arms, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's probably just some forest magic," she joked, though her voice wavered. "Maybe Mildred really is here with us, right?" I didn't answer, just sat down on a log and stared at the board, my mind racing. Mark finally sighed, grabbing his pack. "Look, we're just freaking ourselves out. We'll bury the thing, or burn it, or whatever it takes to get rid of it. There's nothing weird going on." But as we argued about what to do, the board had other plans. The planchette began to move on its own. None of us were touching it, but it scraped slowly over the wood, making this eerie, scratching sound as it spelled out a single word, S-T-O-P. We went silent. The air felt thick, pressing down on us, and for a moment I felt like the entire forest was watching, like it was listening. Ellie's face went pale, her eyes wide with fear, and she whispered, "I think it wants us to leave it alone." We looked at each other, each of us now dead serious. I didn't know what kind of logic I was following. Maybe the lack of sleep, the isolation, the strange unease in the air. But something in my gut told me to listen. "Fine," I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. "We'll leave it. We'll just pack up and go." But as soon as the words left my mouth, the planchette moved again. This time it spelled out 3 more letters, slowly and deliberately, N-O-T. And then, after a pause, it slid over to A-S-K-E-D. The meaning wasn't clear at first, but then it hit me, and a chill ran down my spine. We hadn't asked it anything this time. The board had answered a question we never asked, like it was reading our thoughts, watching us. already knowing the doubts in our minds before we even voiced them. Ellie backed away, tripping over a root, her hand covering her mouth. It's in our heads, isn't it? Mark, who'd been silent until now, stepped closer, his face set in disbelief. This is ridiculous, he muttered, trying to grab the board to toss it aside. But the second he touched it, his face changed, like he'd been shocked. His hand jerked back, and his eyes widened, his breathing quick and shallow. "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mark didn't answer. He just looked at me, then at Ellie, before glancing back at the board. He tried to laugh it off, but it sounded forced. "I don't know, man. It just felt like something was there. Cold, I guess. Probably just nerves." But I knew Mark. He wasn't the type to scare easily, and something about the way he looked at that board, like it had burned him, made me realize this was more than just a game gone wrong. This was something else. The planchette moved again, and I felt my heart sink as it spelled out another message, the letters shifting so quickly it was hard to keep up. Listen. "What do you want?" Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. The board didn't respond. Instead, the planchette moved in quick, jerky motions, almost frantic. It hovered over different letters, not spelling anything coherent, just flitting across the board as if searching for something. Then, finally, it settled on two words, WARNING and FRIEND. We all went still, the meaning sinking in. I could feel a weight settle over the campsite, pressing down on us like an invisible hand. The word friend felt so out of place, so sinister, like a mockery of whatever this presence was trying to be. But the warning, that was clear enough. This thing, whatever it was, didn't want us gone. It wanted us here. "Why?" I asked, the word barely a breath, not even sure I wanted an answer. "Why do you want us to stay?" But the board didn't respond. The planchette just sat there, silent and unmoving, like it was done with us. And that's when I noticed something chilling. In the dirt around the board, where none of us had been standing, there were footprints. They were deep, human-shaped, and circled our campsite in a perfect, unbroken line. For a long, terrifying moment, we just stood there, staring at the footprints that circled us. They were fresh, like someone had just walked through the dirt, pressing deep into the earth. But here's the thing, they weren't any of ours. They were larger, and the strides were too long, almost unnatural, like whoever had made them had been watching, moving around us without making a sound. "Maybe it's just someone messing with us," Mark said, though he sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. But none of us bought it. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles from any other campsite, and if anyone else was out here, they hadn't made themselves known. Ellie shivered, hugging her arms close to her chest. "I don't like this, guys. This doesn't feel right. I mean, what kind of board moves on its own? Or knows things?" I didn't have an answer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd opened a door we couldn't close. My mind kept circling back to that word, warning. It felt like a message, something this presence was desperate for us to understand, even if we couldn't make sense of it yet. "Let's just go back to the car," I said finally, forcing myself to sound calm. "We'll pack up, leave the board here, and get out of here. We don't owe this thing anything." Ellie and Mark nodded, but as we started gathering our things, the planchette scraped across the board, stopping us in our tracks. It moved slowly, like it was struggling, and spelled out one word, DANGER. My stomach twisted, and I could tell by their faces that Ellie and Mark were just as spooked. This time, I couldn't ignore it. "What?" "Danger," I whispered, not even sure it would answer. The board went still, and for a moment, I thought that maybe it was over. But then, slowly, it started spelling again. The letters came in quick bursts, broken words and fragments, almost like it was struggling to get the message across. It spelled Watching, Watches, and then, as if to emphasize, Stayaway. A chill ran through me, deeper than anything I'd felt so far. I couldn't make sense of the words, but the intent behind them was clear. Whatever this thing was, it was warning us about something out here. Something that wasn't it. My instincts screamed at me to listen, to pack up and go, to get as far away from this cursed spot as possible. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being baited, somehow, led on by something that didn't want us to leave. Ellie, her voice trembling, asked, "Are you trying to protect us? Is that it?" The planchette moved again, jerking to yes, then paused before spelling out HURRY. My breath caught. Protect us? From what? This didn't make sense, but before I could ask anything else, there was a sound, a distant high-pitched noise, like laughter, echoing through the trees. It was faint, almost like a child's laugh, and it sent a shiver through all of us. We all froze, ears straining, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but the sound was everywhere and nowhere at once, drifting through the trees. "Did you hear that?" Mark whispered, his voice tight. "Tell me you guys heard that." Ellie and I nodded, our eyes wide. The laughter faded, replaced by an eerie silence that felt even worse, like the forest itself was waiting, watching. I wanted to run, to leave everything behind and bolt for the car, but something kept me rooted in place, heart hammering, unable to look away from the board. Then, without warning, the planchette started moving faster than it had all day, almost like it was in a panic, spelling out words in quick succession. LEAVENOW DONOTFOLLOW. The urgency in those words was palpable. My hands were trembling so hard I could barely keep them steady. Whatever was happening out here, this thing, Mildred or whatever presence we'd contacted, it was telling us to go. It was the first time I'd ever felt like a Ouija board was looking out for me, and the idea alone was terrifying. "We need to listen to it," I said, backing away from the board, not taking my eyes off the trees. I felt like something was out there, lurking just beyond the edges of our sight. Something watching, waiting, like the board had said. We packed up our stuff in silence, each of us moving as quickly as we could, trying not to make noise. But as we turned to leave, I caught one last glimpse of the board, just sitting there on the rock, the planchette eerily still. The words "leave now" burned in my mind, pushing me forward. We were about halfway back to the car when the laughter returned. This time, it was louder, echoing through the trees, coming from every direction. It wasn't playful anymore. It sounded mocking, twisted, as if whatever was out there was taunting us, daring us to look back. "Don't turn around," I whispered, fighting the urge to look over my shoulder. I could feel something creeping up behind us, a dark, heavy presence that grew thicker with every step we took. The laughter faded, replaced by footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, just a few paces behind us, matching our speed as we picked up our pace. My heart was pounding, my legs shaking, but I kept moving, refusing to give in to the instinct to turn around. I felt Ellie grab my arm, her grip tight, her face pale with fear. "Just keep going," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of our footsteps. We were almost to the car when the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, whatever was following us had given up. But then, just as we reached the clearing, the Ouija board's final message echoed in my mind. DONOTLOOK. Against every instinct, I glanced back and instantly regretted it. There, at the edge of the trees, was a figure. It was tall, dark, almost featureless, like a shadow with a human shape, its face hidden in darkness. But what terrified me most was its eyes, two piercing, hollow voids that seemed to stretch into infinity, watching us with an intensity that made my blood run cold. It was Mildred, or something far worse. And then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, I heard it say, "I warned you." I stumbled back, heart racing, my legs frozen to the spot as those eyes, if you could call them that, seemed to bore into me. I couldn't tell if it was Mildred or something else, something darker. All I knew was that it felt wrong, like a void had opened up in the forest, swallowing the light around it. The others noticed me staring and followed my gaze, and in an instant, the car was forgotten. We were all transfixed, gripped by that unnatural figure standing so still, as if daring us to make a move. Ellie was the first to snap out of it, yanking my arm. "Come on, we have to go!" Her voice cracked with fear, the urgency breaking whatever hold that thing had over us. We ran, crashing through the last stretch of trees, not stopping until we practically collapsed onto the gravel next to the car. Mark fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped them. I could feel the sweat on my forehead, my whole body wired with adrenaline. I didn't look back, didn't dare to see if that shadow had followed us. Finally, Mark managed to unlock the car, and we scrambled inside, locking the doors the second we got in. We sat there in silence, each of us catching our breath, too afraid to even turn around. The forest was quiet, deceptively peaceful, as if whatever had chased us was content to let us go. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Mark jammed the keys into the ignition, muttering under his breath. The engine roared to life, and he threw the car into reverse, backing out of the clearing with shaky hands. As we turned onto the dirt road, I glanced out the window, my heart still pounding, expecting to see that figure in the trees. But the woods were empty. Still, I felt it, like a weight pressing down on me, a shadow lingering in my mind, even though it was nowhere in sight. None of us spoke as we drove. The silence stretched, thick with everything we couldn't put into words. Every now and then, I catch Ellie glancing out the window, her face pale, as if she was expecting to see that thing trailing behind us. I wanted to tell her it was fine, that we'd left it back there, but the words wouldn't come. Somehow, I knew they'd be a lie. We reached a gas station about 30 miles from the campsite, a small rundown place on the side of the road. Mark pulled in, too tired and shaken to keep driving. We sat there in the parking lot, the fluorescent lights casting an eerie glow over us, illuminating the fear etched across each of our faces. Ellie broke the silence first, her voice a whisper. "What was that?" None of us had an answer. I didn't want to admit it, but the image of that shadowed figure, those hollow, empty eyes, was burned into my mind. It felt like they were still watching me, still waiting. I could feel them in the darkness, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. Mark rubbed his temples, looking more shaken than I'd ever seen him. It warned us," he muttered, almost to himself. "That thing, it told us not to look. And we did." A heavy silence fell over us, each of us realizing the truth at the same time. We'd broken the rule, ignored the warning, and now it felt like whatever was in those woods wasn't going to let us forget it. Ellie wrapped her arms around herself, her eyes darting to the shadows outside the gas station. Do you think it followed us?" She didn't need to say what she meant. We all felt it, that sense of something just out of reach, something lurking just out of sight. Mark shook his head, his jaw clenched. "I don't know, but I'm not going back there to find out." We spent the rest of the night in that gas station parking lot, none of us able to sleep, too afraid to close our eyes. Every time a car passed by or a breeze rustled the trees, I felt my pulse quicken, half expecting to see that shadowed figure standing in the corner, watching, waiting. I could tell the others felt it too, the weight of something we couldn't see but knew was there. When morning came, the sun rose slowly over the trees, casting a dim grey light over the world. It felt like a relief, but not a full one. We piled back into the car, eager to get as far away from those woods as possible. But as we drove, the feeling didn't lift. If anything, it grew heavier, like that shadow had attached itself to us, lingering just out of reach. After a few hours of driving, we finally reached the city. The familiar streets and buildings should have been comforting, but the sight of home did nothing to ease the tightness in my chest. It was like a weight pressing down on me, reminding me that we hadn't left it behind. Not really. When I got home, I collapsed onto my bed, too exhausted to think, too numb to process what had happened. But sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the darkness, waiting, watching. I told myself it was just my imagination, that once I'd had some rest, it would go away. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard something strange, a soft, whispering sound, like the rustle of leaves drifting through the open window. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen, and felt the chill of realization sink in. The sound was coming from inside my room. I reached for the lamp, fumbling in the dark, my hands shaking as I turned it on. The light flooded the room, casting everything in a warm, comforting glow. But there, on the floor by my bed, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was dirt. A small dark pile of dirt, like something had been tracking it in, leaving footprints. I stared at the pile of dirt on the floor, frozen. There were small clumps, scattered, as if something, or someone, had been walking around, tracking it inside. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, to reason it away. But no one else had been in my room, and I hadn't set foot outside since getting home. A soft breeze stirred the curtains, making them flutter. I glanced at the window, certain I'd closed it when I'd come in. But there it was, half open, letting in a draft. My skin prickled as I walked over to shut it, and as I reached for the latch, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. In the faint reflection of the window, there was a shadow, a tall, dark figure standing at the edge of my room, just beyond the reach of the light. I spun around, heart hammering, but the room was empty. Only my own shadow flickered in the dim light, but I could still feel it, that same heavy, watching presence from the woods. I knew that turning on more lights wouldn't make it go away, but I couldn't stop myself. I flipped on every lamp in the room, flooding it with light, as if that would somehow keep it at bay. But the feeling lingered, that chill clinging to the air like an invisible weight. I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to steady my breathing, to tell myself it was just my imagination. Then, my phone buzzed, the sound jarring in the silence. I picked it up, expecting a message from Mark or Ellie, but the screen showed an unknown number, a text I didn't recognize. "You shouldn't have looked." My pulse quickened, my hands shaking as I typed back a single word. "Who is this?" The response came instantly, like it had been waiting. "A friend." I dropped the phone, heart racing, and glanced around the room, half expecting to see that figure standing right beside me. It felt like it was closing in, like I was surrounded by shadows, each one pressing in closer. My phone buzzed again, the message flashing across the screen. "We warned you. Now we're with you." I tried to tell myself this was some elaborate prank, that maybe Mark or Ellie had decided to mess with me. But deep down, I knew the truth. I could feel it, lingering in the back of my mind, like an unwanted guest that refused to leave. I reached out to call Ellie, hoping for some reassurance, but the line went straight to voicemail. The same happened with Mark. Panic settled in as I sat alone in my room, the silence growing louder, the shadows growing longer. Just as I was about to give up, the phone buzzed one last time. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't ignore it. The message was brief, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. Look out the window. Every instinct told me not to ignore it, to throw my phone across the room and hide. But my body moved on its own. legs shaky as I crossed the room and approached the window. I reached out, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peer out. And there it was. The shadow, standing just at the edge of my yard, perfectly still, almost blending into the darkness. Its face was hidden, but those hollow, empty eyes glowed faintly, like two endless pits locking onto me. A chill ran down my spine, and I backed away, my hands trembling, unable to tear my gaze away from the window. As I watched, the shadow took a single step forward, then another, slow, deliberate, like it knew there was no need to rush. It was coming for me, closing the distance inch by inch, as if savoring the fear radiating from the house. I stumbled back, slamming the curtain shut, heart pounding in my chest. But even with the window covered, I could feel it, pressing in from the darkness, watching me from beyond the walls. I scrambled back to my bed, pulling the blankets up like a child hiding from a nightmare. But I knew it wouldn't help. I knew that nothing would. The lights flickered, and I felt a wave of cold settle over the room, deeper and darker than any chill I'd felt before. I lay there, clutching the blankets, my breath coming in shallow gasps, listening as the house creaked, as footsteps echoed down the hallway, slow and heavy. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, and I held my breath, frozen, waiting for whatever would come next. I wanted to scream, to call out, but my voice caught in my throat, paralyzed with terror. Then, just as quickly as they'd come, the footsteps retreated, the sound fading down the hall, leaving me alone in the silence. But I knew that it wasn't over. That shadow, that figure from the woods, it was with me now, woven into the walls of my home, into the spaces between breaths, hiding in every shadow that crept across my floor. It hadn't left. It was simply waiting, watching, a constant reminder of the warning I hadn't heeded. I knew, deep down, that it would follow me wherever I went.